All right, well, it is 1 o'clock, so I am happy to get everybody started here. So welcome. Thank you for joining us today for this Q&A webinar with Expert Mentoring Program Evaluator, John Harris. My name is Sarah Wilkinson. I'm the Program Coordinator here at Mentor Virginia. Before we get started, I just want to go over a couple of housekeeping things. First of all, please note that we are recording this webinar so that we're able to give it to some of our other program partners, maybe even put it on our website, and we'd be more than happy to email it out to anybody on this webinar who wants a copy of it as well. And then secondly, there are a few Zoom meeting features that I think it would be helpful for you all to be aware of, especially since this is a Q&A that tends to be a little more of an engaging format. It might be helpful. So the first feature to take note of is the chat box, which you can access from the menu along the bottom of your screen. So please feel free to use the chat box to ask any questions of John or of me if you need any clarification about anything that he's saying. I will be monitoring the chat box on John's behalf throughout the webinar. The second feature to note is the raise hand feature. So you can access that by going to your participants tab along the bottom of your screen. And then if you look to the right bottom hand corner, there should be a raise hand icon. So you can use that anytime you want to have us pause so that you can ask a question or get some clarification. We'll be monitoring that as well. And then the third feature is that you probably all noticed that when you arrived into this webinar, you were all muted automatically. But if at any point you would like to ask a question, you can unmute yourself. There are two ways to do that. You can click the microphone icon in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. You can also go to the participants tab and find your name, and then there should be an unmute button there as well. So definitely encourage folks to feel free to use any of those features to engage throughout this webinar. So those are my housekeeping items. So without any more delays, I'm happy to pass the mic over to John Harris, who will be our speaker today, and I will let him introduce himself.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I really appreciate you putting all this together and just putting in the effort to be so organized and prepared for it. Super helpful. Folks, I'm so happy that you're able to join us today. I really appreciate you taking time out of your busy day to do that. I hope that at least some of you have got your lunch in front of you and are able to chow down while we're doing this. I loved the questions that you all indicated you were hoping that I would cover, because they could not have more perfectly lent themselves to the stuff I think is really worth talking about and that I was prepared well to cover. So I have got a PowerPoint presentation that I think should be really tailored well to addressing what you want to know, but I'm just going to re-emphasize what Sarah already said. If I'm not covering what you want to know, please raise your hand or make a chat or unmute yourself and let me know. If I know that I'm going to cover that in a slide or two, I'll tell you. And if it's not something that was going to be covered, I'll really appreciate it, because I would hate for anybody to leave this without feeling like they got what they wanted out of it. So Sarah, just triple checking before we go forward, you're seeing the slideshow presentation version of my show, not just the work one, right?
Yes.
Super, thank you. All right, so there we go. Why should you listen to me? I am an independent consultant. I've been evaluating mentoring programs for 20 years. I've got a fairly humble website with a great name, though, that says what I do. And you can certainly check me out there, but I'm best known for what I've written and created, and that's the Youth Mentoring Survey and the Match Characteristics Questionnaire, which measure satisfaction in what the match does together, and how even things outside of the pair affect them. And with Mike Nuckola, my co-author on those surveys, we wrote the chapters on assessing match quality in the Handbook of Youth Mentoring. And then there's a couple other things I've written. Generally, though, I'm a consultant. I'm not an academic, and I've made a life of trying to connect research and practice and really, honestly, do exactly what the NMRC has been making it so easy for you all to do. I've really just loved what the NMRC is doing with the technical assistance provider opportunities, where you can get somebody like me, you can get me to do free work for you, providing evaluation assistance. You can get technical assistance for implementation stuff too. So I'll touch on that more. And Sarah, if you feel at the end of it that I haven't beaten that horse well and truly dead, please let me know, because I really think that it's just an incredible resource. It's the best thing that I can think of that's happened to the field in 20 years, honestly. All right, today's agenda boils down to some introductory stuff that I think is probably important to cover to make sure that everybody's working with some important basic information. But then I'm going to get right into the questions that you all indicated you wanted to address. Like, how do I engage it? How do I start? Where do I get traction? What are the best things I have to do? How is that going to change over the course of my, of the time I'm in my program? And you see, I've broken these into broad and nicely done. Broad and broad questions that should read specific questions below. The broad questions are questions that are going to be addressed really over the course of the entire time we're talking today, because there's so much that goes into each of those things. Beginning isn't just a simple do this or do that. Best practices is really what we're going to talk about throughout. And evaluating over time, my simple, like one sentence answer to how you shift your evaluation efforts over time is that you should be trying to do more and more rigorous work. And so really, as we talk through the course of this presentation, the answers to your questions are going to largely be, towards the bottom of the slides, where you're going to want to do something that maybe has a little more money put into it and has a little bit more rigor, that requires a little more sophistication and effort on your part, because you don't want to start off doing this. You don't want to start off trying to sprint. You walk and then run and move on up. The specific questions I'll address, the more specific are, for a fledgling program, I loved that phrase. Where do you start there? How would you go about that? We'll address that. And how do you tell a compelling story, especially that satisfies your constituents, your volunteers, because compelling stories for your volunteers are different from the stories that funders want to hear. We're going to talk about the measures that you might want to look at doing, although I'm not going to get horribly specifically into that, because we could get very specific in available tools. Look at the NMRC website. Again, if anybody feels like I'm moving too fast or too slow, let us know through the chat. We have the luxury, because there aren't dozens of you, to try and tailor this on the fly, and I will be as flexible as I can be as I go. All right, very quickly, nobody asked, I'm just going to cover quickly. The reasons you evaluate should motivate everything you do, okay? Number one is because we all need a check on what we do. It's not enough to just do good work. You have to do it well. And gathering data is how you understand exactly how to do that. And the phrase I really like to use in talking with people about that is quality control. If we were building cars and some of our cars came out marvelously and some of our cars came out with the wheels falling off, nobody'd buy our cars. And I think you can apply those same ideas to mentoring. And I think of that in terms of making your worst matches more like your best matches, and making your best matches as good as they can be. you'd be surprised. Over the course of years, I've realized that even really well-run programs have huge differences still between their best and worst matches. And I think that's an area where the field can really improve. And then finally, you evaluate because it's good for your program. If you understand what keeps matches together and what creates outcome, you can create more outcome per dollar of budget, and funders will just love that. You can demonstrate that to funders and raise money and do the work you really want to do, which is great for morale and for the kids you're serving. All right, so now I'll step off that soapbox. I think that as we think, so sorry, about where to begin your evaluation, you need to start thinking about what are the challenges you're going to face. To start, you've got to clear initial hurdles, and that means understanding what your program does and how it's going to do that, all right? Which means once you understand those things, you'll know what to measure and demonstrate. If you don't have a clear understanding of that, haven't done a logic model, then you're really going to have a hard time helping even a pro like me understand what to measure for you. Sure, I can come in and tell you what's a standard thing to measure, but the first thing I do with any client is ask them enough about their program that I have a broad sense myself of how it should work, okay? So that everything they measure should be pretty tailored to them. You've got to figure out what you can do yourself versus what somebody else has to do. Then you have to get the right support for yourself for whatever it is you're going to do, what element of that you're going to do. You have to design it, figure out how to pay for it. And here's a big one. You have to engage all of the constituents. And this is a tough one. It's not something you might ordinarily think about. Just because you want to do it doesn't mean that everybody in your organization is going to be bought in. And the bigger the organization, the harder that buy-in can be. It can take years to really institute what I think of it as a culture of accountability. So that's how you want to work at it, making sure that everybody's bought in. Otherwise, you won't collect good data, and you won't. If you don't have good data, you can't learn what you need to about your program. You also have to figure out how to integrate your evaluation into the program. What that means is you don't want to waste a lot of time. Wherever possible, fold the evaluation into existing processes like the intake or times when you're going to be in front of a mentee anyway. So that it's less work for you and less work for them. A good example of this would be collecting permission slips. Well, just make sure that the permission slip that you create at the beginning of the year covers evaluation. Otherwise, you've got to go out and collect permission slips again, and that's just a grand pain. Carrying out a good evaluation, you've got to figure out how to manage your time and effort and avoid pitfalls, and I will talk to you about how to do that. So I'm realizing that I'm sitting here delivering a presentation to my screen, and it's always just so different from delivering something to a room full of people, because in the room, I can gather visual information about whether people are nodding or tuning out. So I'll tell you what, if anybody's feeling like, oh, this is dragging or something like that, please, I'm an evaluator. I can take it. Chat it up and let me know. Okay. Here is an example of a logic model. I don't know how well you can see it on your screens. I've got a ginormous screen, and so I can look at it. The important thing here is not the details, and I'm certainly not going to cover all of this. The point is that the NMRC on their website provides this, okay? This is a download, and you can download it for other program models other than community-based one-on-one. But it shows you the kinds of things you need to be thinking about before you even try to get into an evaluation. You need to understand what do your students, and by the way, ideally, this is something you guys did before you started even programming, right? Because having a well-developed logic model not only tells you how to evaluate, more importantly, it tells you how to do what you want to do. But you need to figure out what your constituents need, what you're going to bring to them in the way of inputs and activities that are going to address that need, what are the outputs that are going to happen out of that, like the implementation indicators, number of times that you met and things like that, the activities that were completed. And once you understand all of that, you can begin to think very clearly about the outcomes. It'll seem very clear to you, all right, this is, what we can expect to address. And the reason I put this at the front of the show, aside from the fact that the logic model should be at the beginning, is that it addresses the question of what to measure. The last box, outcomes, addresses a bunch of categories: personal, socio-environmental, risk avoidance in terms of personal and socio-environmental, positive functioning, reduced adaptive difficulties, and transition to adulthood. I read all those because they might be too small on your screens, but those are short, intermediate, and long-term outcomes, or types of outcomes, that you might want to consider measuring. When I work with a client, after I feel like I understand what they need, I send them out a tool, and I can happily provide this tool to you all, that asks them to rate and rank something on the order of 20 different things that the research has demonstrated are important to cover, things that are included on, in here, and maybe a couple others. There's not perfect overlap, but my point is that then I can think very carefully with somebody about, all right, not only are we measuring something that the field has shown, mentoring can affect, and we can expect to see some kind of change, but we're measuring something that really gets at the change you do. And folks, this is something you probably know, but an incredibly important lesson I've learned about mentoring is that there are so many different flavors of mentoring. I mean, you can say school-based, community-based, group mentoring, et cetera, e-mentoring, but that's just at the macro level. You get to really fine differentiations based on, is there a curriculum? What does the curriculum, or even just the training that's provided to mentors, focus on? All of you are probably doing something slightly different. That means we need to measure something different to really show the outcomes that make sense for your program. So if you're going to do your own evaluation, you want to give some very careful thought to that. And it's the kind of thing that a ringer like me can help you do. Another really important thing that you have to think about when you're gaining traction is, how are you going to pay for an evaluation? And here I want to go again back to the NMRC. You can get me to work for you minimally 30 hours and as many as 50 hours in a year for free on the NMRC, on a federal nickel. Okay, that's an incredible resource. The application process is a breeze. People get through it just in no time at all. This is not like, if any of you have done a grant or something like that, nothing in the ballpark of that. You can be done with this in an hour or two, I think. And then all of a sudden you can get help either with implementation or evaluation or both, whatever you need. I have worked with clients to develop tools that are specific to their program. And that can be, usually it's outcome tools, but it can be other tools as well. I've left programs I've worked with outcome surveys that are hard copy and usable online, scoring tools for both of those, administration guides, for when they're administering the surveys, the whole 9 yards. Enough resources that they've got the tools to start really collecting excellent program-specific data. And I know that programs I've worked with have gotten outstanding implementation consultation from Mentor Virginia as well. If you want something grander, so you're talking about their minimally like $2,000 and maximally maybe $3,000 worth of work in a year. If you need something bigger than that, then you want to start thinking about doing grants, leveraging university resources. Like, hey, in Richmond, you might want to talk to profs at VCU and other universities. There are universities all over the place, and the professors may be willing to take something on if it serves their purposes. They've got to publish and perish, right? In most cases. Now, the benefit in those cases can be you can get inexpensive support that's expert, and they sometimes can bring research assistants to bear that really help. Like, for instance, when I do larger projects that are not funded through the NMRC, I'll bring Mike Knuckle up at University of Pennsylvania, my co-author on all these things, my partner in crime. And we have at times put 8, 10 research assistants on teams to go collect data and help analyze data. It's just an extraordinary resource. The caveat with that is that the prof, it has their own agenda. And in that sense, it's not free to you because they've got to collect something that aligns with what they need to be able to write about and study. So, you know, if you need the flexibility, getting a grant or even just setting aside some budget of your own, programmatic budget can make a lot of sense. There, you just tell me if you've got budget, whether it's grant funded or out of your operating budget, or rather out of your broader programs budget. You know, you would tell me exactly what you need. I'd help you think about what you need. We'd make it as cost effective as possible, and go forward. As a rule of thumb, you would never want to spend more than 10% of your operating of your overall budget on evaluation. And whatever you spend, you want to make sure you're getting something out of it that makes it cost effective, right? You don't want to just do it to do it. Yes, it will help you raise funding in the future, but if you do it right, it will help you make more matches. Now, I tell my clients that if we do this right, they should make more matches that do better mentoring in a budget that includes me than a budget that doesn't, all right? So you can go for federal and private grants. When if you do those things, you need to get competitive proposals from the likes of me. And I don't think we'll have time today, but I can talk you through, you know, what to look for in those proposals. And my final thought on paying for evaluation is very important. The cost goes beyond dollars, all right? Your time is a resource, and the time of your staff, and even the time that your mentors and mentees are going to spend doing, you know, helping you collect the data, all of that has to be considered when you think about what you're going to do. And feasibility is just the absolute key. I'm going to pause, take a breath, and ask if anybody is feeling lost or like we're not on the way to getting at what they want to do. We're covering at this point how to start your evaluation and getting oriented to understanding some of the more specific questions we're going to work at. Okay, I don't see anybody typing. So break in if you ever want to. As we get further into this, you're going to be aware that there are different types of evaluation you can do. As a fledgling program, the most important thing you could do is probably a process evaluation. And that's where you figure out how well is my program working and is it being implemented the way I want it to? Essentially, is the rubber meeting the road the way I think it does? Now, you might, you know, as the director, if you're the director of a program, say, oh yeah, sure, I told everybody very clearly what to do. That doesn't mean that's what's happening. And it almost never happens exactly like you drew it up. You want to know exactly how it's happening. And a process evaluation will tell you that. And especially in the early years of the program where you're working out the kinks, this works, that doesn't, we're going to amend the program this way or that. you really don't want to be doing an outcome evaluation while you're doing that. Number one, an outcome evaluation is it's a time sink. It's an extra thing you're taking on. And at a time when you're trying to get your implementation strong and that's in flux, taking on a rigorous big outcome evaluation is going to deflect from the thing that's really important, and that's the implementation. You've got to get that done right, okay? So in the early years, really focus on process evaluation. We'll talk about how to go about that. Just broadly though, I'm a big fan of interviewing in the early years. I think that just tells you an immense amount of very useful stuff. Once your program has settled into how it's going to go about itself, go about its work, how you're going to implement stuff, and there's some stability, then I think it's a good idea to put some time into an outcome evaluation. This is not to say that you can't begin preparing for your outcome evaluation earlier, and we'll talk about how to do that. I'm just saying, be very thoughtful about, I get well-meaning people who are just starting when did you start your program? This year? And I want to be really accountable and responsible, so I want to do an outcome evaluation right now. I love the outcome, the commitment to accountability, okay? In my work with programs, I've found that programs that don't just talk it, but really talk about how they're making sure everybody's accountable for doing good work, those are the programs that serve kids well and grow and thrive. Everything in its measure. And I would be happy to think with any of you individually about what that measure should be. All right. Your process evaluation, there are two broad ways that you can collect data. And one is through interviews, qualitative data, that's stories. The other is quantitative, and that's numbers. Qualitative data is doing interviews with individuals or with groups. You can observe what's going on. So it's very labor intensive, and it takes some real skill to do it well. You don't have to have a huge amount of skill to get somebody to talk to you. Frankly, talent goes a long way here, but making sure that you're not just getting them to tell you what you want to hear, and making sure that you're collecting the data you really need to understand. I think it's really helpful to have a ringer or somebody who's really experienced and educated around this stuff to do that type of data collection. Because it requires the skill and it's generally done in a more labor-intensive way, it's a higher cost per participant, so it's really best for small groups, okay? You would not interview everybody in a big program, all right? If I've conducted 10 interviews in a program, say 5 mentors and 5 mentees, I feel like I'm getting a decent bead on how that program works, what it's like in that program, okay? So analyzing qualitative data, frankly, if I've done an interview, I've already been analyzing it as I go, right? Because I'm thinking, oh, hey, this is what they're telling me, and here's what I think about it. But the more advanced analysis is very complex, and you probably don't want to try this at home. Qualitative data collection is super for recruiting because you get stories and anecdotes, right? Joey did this with his mentor and did this, and the other thing, and the mentor was really trying to do X, Y, and Z, and it really helped Joey. Joey feels this way about it, and because of that, this, that, and the other thing happened. If you can flesh that out with honest quotes and details that somebody really felt, that comes through, and it means a ton to your volunteers, and it really can help you understand how outcomes are created. Okay, a critical process, but it's really not widely appreciated by funders. More often, it's useful for you and your volunteers. Most funders, that's fine, all well and good for them, but they want the numbers. So let's talk about that. You get number data with surveys or by collecting the type of data schools can provide, grades, suspensions and attendance, things like that, numbers. And for that reason, it's a lot easier to collect a ton of data in short order, right? I can collect data from 50 people if I just have all the surveys in place and a big enough room, okay? Well, candidly, I'd want some assistance, but my point is I can collect chunks of data at a time. So you've got a lower cost per participant. It's great for large samples. But the analysis, look, we've all got Excel now and you can get scores, but has everybody heard the phrase lies? I'm gonna lower it to darn lies and statistics. Well, there's a reason for that. You can use numbers to say anything. And even people who mean really well, all right, can have a tough time understanding what numbers are really telling them, okay? So it's great to know what survey scores are. It's great to keep a beat on that. I think in particular, it's great to know what match quality scores tell you. I think that's very important. But to really relate those things and understand the story that they're telling, hire a ringer like me, please. Otherwise, you can really end up misunderstanding what's going on and actually harming your program and doing yourself a great disservice at the expense of a lot of time and effort. All right, so let's focus on quantitative designs because qualitative designs are pretty simple. Quantitative designs, a process evaluation would really just be try and get some kind of representation from the different types of match that you have. If you are working with elementary, middle, and high school students, try to get a mentor and mentee from at least one from each of those age groups, preferably at least 2 or 3 from each of those 2 or 3 matches from each of those age groups. If you can spare it, it's great to talk to constituents who might have other perspectives. For instance, parents or teachers in a school-based program. They'll tell you a lot about that. It's really a breeze to set that up. Quantitative designs are a lot more complicated. There are 3 broad levels I've broken it down for here, and this gets at the question of how should you be evaluating your program over time. From word one, from the day that you start doing any mentoring, you should be collecting descriptive data. And that's very simply what's happening, right? The number of meetings, if you can possibly swing it, what they're doing together is very useful information to have. It can also be those things like how many times has the person who manages the matches provided formal supervision to the mentor and to the mentee, 2 different things, over the course of the year. Ideally, you're doing it pretty close to every month. And to know how much time is being spent and whether that's being spent, that's a critical indicator. Other things that you could describe would be whether key things were accounted for in the matching process. Did you account for interests? Did you account for family composition and other relationships? Did you account for need? These are things that somebody like me can take on the back end and use to help you understand, hey, when you account for these things in a match and train your mentor to do that, and the mentor shows up to this many trainings and you supervise this often, you get outcomes that are meaningfully different from when you do this other level of that stuff. So you want to collect good descriptive data that shows what you're doing. You don't need special tools, and you can do it in the software you're using to track everything else. As a side note here, if you haven't already done it, create an ID number for every match so that you can track every piece of data by that ID number. the data for the mentor, for the mentee, everything associated with a match. And that, we'll think of that as internal evaluation. Excellent stuff that you all can do. Correlational evaluation is where you're just relating one thing to another. And that's frankly what I do for most of my clients because it's affordable, all right? I can't at the end of the day then tell them that their mentoring caused outcomes, okay? And of course, that's what funders love to hear. But we know that mentoring is helping, okay? And if I can show for a client that the way they do the mentoring is associated with differences in the outcomes the kids get, that shows that there's a connection between the two things. And we can get the program to start focusing more on doing what's associated with the best outcomes. So that, yes, you can do that internally, but I think it's best to bring in a ringer like me for that. But you can do it on a fairly small budget. I can help you out. I can do some of this type of stuff. The NMRC doesn't, they like to teach you how to bake. They don't give you bread so much. And they want to give you the resources to bake. So for instance, they'll give you the surveys and help you learn how to use them. But then they want you to begin collecting data or go out and raise your own budget to do a more highfalutin evaluation. But for $3,500 to $5,000, you can totally get useful insight on your program. And in the 5 to 10K range, you can get a ton. Anything over that, and you can really do a large, complicated, excellent evaluation. For quasi-experimental and experimental evaluations, you're going to have somebody come in and help you. You need a ringer for that, but this is the gold standard. When you want to know what are best practices in evaluation, this is best practice. Get a comparison sample or even randomly assign students to different conditions, and often that could be served and not served. When you do those types of approaches, you can conclude that the mentoring is responsible for the outcomes that you're seeing, and say with much greater confidence how those outcomes are being achieved. But again, those types of things are going to happen at a higher budget. And they're also, I should probably have a bullet in here that says it's a lot higher effort on your part because you have to find the comparison sample. A comparison sample, for instance, would be students at another school or students within the same school, say, as a school-based program, who aren't receiving the mentoring but have a similar profile to the students who are receiving the mentoring. You would collect data from both sets and then say, are the students who get the mentoring doing any better than the students who don't get the mentoring? And then with the experimental, that's where you would take everybody who applies for mentoring and randomly assign them to conditions. Again, most often would be, you don't get the mentoring this year, you have to wait a year, or you get the mentoring this year. And the students who have to wait a year, then you would measure them the same way you measure the students who got the mentoring, and you'd see whether there was a big difference. All right, so getting started with your actual evaluation. We talked about logic model. We've talked about committing and creating a culture of accountability and budgeting, building buy-in and collecting descriptive data. So I guess at this point, forgive me for being redundant. I'm summarizing what we've covered to this point. Getting the right help is another really important step, all right? You wouldn't ask me to come run your program if you didn't think that I had the knowledge and expertise to do it, okay? Even being steeped in the mentoring literature and having evaluated programs for decades and blah, 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 I could probably step in and do something other than a completely awful job, but it sure wouldn't be what I know mentoring directors are doing, okay? It just wouldn't be. I don't have that skill set, and I don't have the experience. I wouldn't begin to know how to work with a board. I wouldn't have the very specific, practical, day-to-day answers that you have to have. And similarly, you guys, it's not as simple as pushing numbers around around a spreadsheet and coming up with numbers, right? There's real knowledge, experience, and insight required to do this well. And doing it wrong will actually hurt your program and get you to waste time and effort. There's a ton of free and cost-effective support through the NMRC and through other online resources. Beyond that, you can find ringers like me to help you. I thought now would be a good time to cover the pitfalls. So big picture, when we're thinking about what are best practices, perhaps it's the pessimist in me. I think it's helpful to think about best practices to avoid pitfalls. So when you're designing, you want to avoid overreach. Feasibility, I cannot overstate how important this is. When I was just getting into evaluation, I sometimes made the mistake of letting clients take on more than they could really do. And we ended up we just didn't do as good work as we would have done if we had taken on something that was more modest, but more feasible. So really you have to be honest with yourself, thinking about what you can take on and what your staff can take on in order to do that work. Even recently, I had a client that ended up, she was able to take it on to start, but then her offices moved and her program became swallowed as a part of a broader program, and that changed how she was supposed to do her work. It really became very difficult for her. She ended up really having a hard time getting through it. Insufficient buy-in, we've discussed. Spending money on stuff that you think might look good, but isn't really going to accomplish what you need. Another thing you want to avoid. You have to expect complications. The execution is critical. Best practices. You've got to collect basic information. I have had clients who come to me and want me to do a good evaluation for them, but they've been working for years and they don't know when their matches were made. And it's just a critical thing because I am then in a position where I can't tell them how dosage affects their outcomes. It's not like evaluation is useless at that point, but when things like that are missing, it really curtails the insight that I can provide. Getting incomplete data like pre-test but no post is a real limiter. And of course, anytime that you collect bad data, for instance, you don't encourage students to take things seriously and really help them understand why what we're doing is important. You can't include it. And then finally, I find that people struggle to benefit sometimes because they misinterpret findings. Over the years, I've become very conservative about what I report. I only report the strongest, most important findings because people will glom on to the finding that says what they want or is interesting or scary to them, even if it's a small finding. Really focus on the big picture and do what's most important. They won't use what it is. They'll take the report, show a funder that they did, and put it in a drawer. Those types of things really curtail how your program can grow and benefit. All right, I'm going to gloss over this. I've addressed most of this, but who should do the evaluation? Depends on what you need. If you want something pretty simple, do it yourself. Do whatever you can do by yourself. Process evaluation and collecting descriptive data. Even collecting data that somebody can analyze for you at a future date. There is no reason why all of you couldn't get NMRC funding to have me help you create and use outcome surveys, and you could collect data for 3 years before you come to me or somebody else to analyze that more fully for you. when you want to really work on learning how your program is doing in a more formal way, you should have that done by a pro, external, and I think that should happen every 3 to 5 years. You do not want to spend money on somebody like me every year. Unless you have a funder who's demanding it, it's just not a good use of your time. The data collection can happen every year, but the analysis and the big expense should only happen every 3 to 5. All right. I'm looking at the agenda and realizing, yeah, I just want to re-emphasize that your compelling story is told with the qualitative data, okay? But most strongly, but you also can use numbers to tell stories as well. Like, I consider it a story to say that, for instance, you know, a program is helping African-American students better than it's helping Hispanic students, or helping girls better than it's helping boys, or helping students whose mentors focus on relationship more than mentors who don't. And, you know, I'm a data geek, so I find those stories compelling, but most people simply aren't going to find them as compelling. Stories through qualitative data are really going to answer that. We addressed common measures when we talked about the logic model. I may not have time today to take you to the NMRC website. If I don't, what I want you to be sure to do is go to the NMRC and look at their tools to support assessment. It's called Measurement Guidance Toolkit. So even if you just Google search NMRC Measurement Guidance Toolkit, you will learn what you need to learn. And they'll have marvelous tools for you to use to measure what you need to measure. I'm going to gloss over finding evaluators because I think that the mentor Virginia can help you do that. We've talked about it. I'm going to gloss over designing your evaluation now because I want to move quickly to this and finish with some more thoughts about what to measure and how to measure it. Here is an image that I put together. I'm better at evaluation than I am at graphics. The point here is that you take a mentee and a mentor, both of whom have individual characteristics, something that's important to measure. You match them with a process that is important to measure. How did you match them? Okay. And when they're matched, now they're a dyad. Their mentor, the mentor is doing the work, okay? And you enter, you know, a period where you can measure the match characteristics. How satisfied are they each with what's being done? What is happening when they meet together? And how are other things like logistics affecting that process? Well, you want to measure all of those things, okay? You want to measure the way your model and approach are affecting the match and what the match is doing, because the way those things interact, all of those things, mentee characteristics, the matching, your model, and what those two people do together is going to influence the youth outcomes, okay? And you can measure every aspect of that process, including the training and support that's provided, all of the implementation, all right? And the more you measure, the more data you collect, the more nuanced you can be about understanding how it works. One of the things I have found is that different programs, programs serve different subgroups very differently. So for instance, older white males appear to me to benefit from mentoring differently from older white females, okay? And differently from people of other ethnicities, and different from younger age groups, etc. Okay, so the more specific you can be, the more a ringer like me can help you think that out. When you get, I think we've talked quite a bit about what to measure. The one point I'd want to emphasize here is that you want to use well-validated tools. Okay, Typically, you want to measure outcomes at the beginning and end of a year. You want to measure the match dynamics towards the end of the year. And you want to always do not create your own tools. It will give you, forgive me, but even really intelligent, skilled practitioners tend to create useless or really limited tools of limited value. So use things that are on the NMRC, or have me develop, somebody like me develop something very specific for you. You want to collect, as I say, individual characteristics, match characteristics, implementation characteristics, and we'll distribute this, this PowerPoint, so you'll have all this stuff listed here. And then within the match characteristics, you're looking at your satisfaction with the quality, okay, but also what do they do and what's valued in the match. Each match is going to be different in that way. You want to look at the relationship, but also the instrumentality. Like, do they like each other and are they happy seeing each other, but are they working on stuff? Okay, or are they just more playing together? The most comprehensive surveys, and I'm certainly biased, but the most comprehensive surveys to measure this stuff, the Youth Mentoring Survey and the Match Characteristics Questionnaire, and I really do recommend you consider those. Those are available through the NMRC website and my website. Let's gloss over this. You can look at it later, but it emphasizes that most of the tools that are out there measure very narrow portions of what I think is important to understand about how a match works. And that's why I think that a more comprehensive tool like the YMS or the MCQ is worth using. I think rather than try and go further now, I'd like to open up once again to see whether people have more specific questions about anything I've covered or anything they wish I'd covered. If not, I can take roughly, I think, Sarah, am I correct in thinking I can take a few more minutes to cover stuff?
Yes, John, you can take until maybe 3 minutes before, I think will be just fine.
Super, so I've got we can do 5 minutes of more specific Q&A, where I think at this point it'd probably be most efficient to unmute yourself and ask a question, or you can type something in if you'd rather. I'll pause for 30 seconds to see whether anybody considers something, and if not, I'll plow forward. I'm really good at yapping. Sarah, is there anybody still online?
Yes, John, we still have a few people on. They're very quiet.
Well, I hope that what this means is that I've really gotten at the things that people hoped that they would learn. I'll tell you what, I will quickly try and unshare this and share the NMRC website.
John, we did get a question in the group chat.
Super, what's that?
It says, when are you collecting the data?
Ah, great question. Sorry, I was looking at the bottom and it was at the top. Thank you so much. The answer to that is outcome data is typically best to collect pre-test before the match begins. All right, so before anybody gets any service. And the reason it's so important to do that really before they get any service is that as soon as a kid sees their mentor, their hopes skyrocket and their attitudes can change dramatically just because they're introduced to a new possibility. Okay, so basically you want ideally to measure just as soon as somebody says they want to be in the program, because you don't want to miss that just immediate uptick in attitude and orientation that can happen because somebody suddenly becomes aware that something else is a possibility. so you've done your pre-test, then you're collecting, it's great to do that at intake, by the way. It can help you, the same type of data you collect for pre-test can help you understand how to make a good match, right? This is a student who struggles with delinquent behavior, or this is a student who struggles particularly with academics or with self-esteem, whatever it is. Help you think about how to match them. And then you want to do the same exact measurement at the end of the year. For a school-based program, typically that'll be a few weeks before the end of the year, before everybody checks out mentally. For a community-based program, that can be, you know, an annual thing, like when you do your re-up, are you going to continue in the program meeting? You can do a post-test with them then. For a school-based program, you'd want to do your measurement of match dynamics either with the outcome measure or a couple of weeks before it. You want to give them the max time to make a mature relationship and really have a good perspective on it. And you don't want to give that measure when the match is over for the year, for instance, in a school-based program, because people can do kind of a defensive, take a negative perspective on the match defensively. Oh, no, it really didn't matter that much to me, so I'm not that sad that it's ended for the year. And then you want to do that every year. It's important to do it every year at regular intervals. And so follow up, please. I'm seeing a follow up. Is it ever appropriate to collect data at the semester mark? Yes, as a matter of fact. But what you want to do is be really careful to avoid over testing. Really zealous, hard-working practitioners, I've got one in mind I'm working with right now, took it on themselves to collect data, not just at pre and post, but also in the middle of the year. And candidly, it's really a diminishing return on your investment. There are certain types of data that might be useful for that, but I would recommend against it unless you really think that you're going to lose somebody. The one type of data that I think can be very useful, or in the middle of the year, would be an abbreviated measure of match dynamics, so that you have a sense earlier in the match about how it's going, and that's going to give you more of an opportunity to intervene if there's a problem. But if you're doing the type of best practices supervision that I hope you're all doing, you guys will know about that within the first month anyway. Great questions. Anybody else? Yeah.
You just got another one in the chat.
Thanks. Are there any good models for data collecting in a summer-specific program? Ooh, great question. In a summer program, you're working with a very 3 months. You are either dealing with a very specific model that's going to be very close to tutoring, or you're doing something that you're going to have to you're going to have to measure your outcomes after the program ended. And here's what I mean. If you're paying me, if I'm doing a program where I'm teaching people math concepts, it's so easy to measure at the beginning of the summer and at the end of the summer, and was there improvement, right? Because we're right on a very specific outcome. If you have a super specific, concrete outcome to measure, that will lend itself to your program. But for the types of programs, outcomes rather, that mentoring tends to help with the most, those develop over longer periods of time, and because of a relationship that typically takes longer than 3 months to develop. So in that kind of case, I think you might want to pre-test and then measure, again, 6 or 12 months, whenever you can get access to those students again after the program ended. I would want to think with you more carefully about your specific program in a specific, a one-on-one conversation, though, so that before I gave you any strong direction. Those were ballpark thoughts about that question. Excellent question, though. Other questions? Well, folks, I really appreciate you participating. I really hope that this has been helpful to you. If you have questions that I did not address or you felt might be more specific to your program and you didn't want to raise them with everybody, feel free to reach out to me by email or on phone, by phone, and I will be very happy to help you. And you know, Mentor Virginia will help connect you with me and other folks who can really do a great job helping you. I'm so grateful to you for carrying enough to join us today. Sarah, did you want to close?
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you everybody for participating in the webinar today. A big thanks to John Harris for his time, for all of his great expertise on this, and for plugging our TA service, which I really encourage, if you're not already taking advantage of it, to consider applying for some TA, whether that's for program evaluation or to develop some other elements of your programs. That is a great free resource that is here. And shortly after the webinar, within the next couple of days, I will be sending out a follow-up email. I'll include all the resources that John has been talking about. I'll make sure you have his contact information, include a little bit of information about applying for TA, just in case that's helpful. And I'll also try and send along a recording of this webinar today. So look out for that. And other than that, just thanks again. And I look forward to continuing our partnership with all of you and your programs in 2020.
All right, thank you.